Hello everyone, and the topic for today is the process to dissolve the ego. We're also going to talk about a practice called the death in motion. This is largely a theoretical lecture, but there is a practical element to it as well in the practice of the death in motion. Let's start off with a quote. This is from Samael Aun from his book called The Revolutionary Psychology. Any attempt at liberation, however magnificent it may be, is doomed to failure if it does not take into account the need to dissolve the ego. We've already come across in our work so far that what stops us from remembering ourselves is, of course, the ego. It's those habitual reactions that we have that come along all the time, those mechanical behaviours. To remember ourselves requires an effort, and it's different from the normal way in which we live our lives along the horizontal path. So that already tells us that there is a resistance there. The ego itself is not useful to us. It causes us many difficulties and many troubles in life. All of these automatic reactions that we have, for example, they keep us on a certain level of being. They keep us in a kind of a situation that we've always found ourselves in, with the psychology repeating itself day in, day out. There is an interesting story about a monk in India who retired to a cave in the Himalayas, and he told his followers in the village down below, he said, "When you next see me, I will be liberated, I will be awakened." And so they waited and waited for him to come down from the mountain, and many years passed, 15 years, and then it went to 20 years, and then finally he descended from the mountain. He came out from his cave, and when they saw him coming, they all ran in a great crowd to meet him. And they were eager to see what it was like for someone who had worked all those years in the cave to descend, having achieved his liberation. And as they swarmed around him, one of them trod on his foot. And when that happened, he immediately flew into a reaction. "How dare you tread on my foot? Don't you know who I am?" And then everybody shrank back and they withdrew, because they realized that he'd spent all those years in the mountain, but he had not yet learnt how to overcome a basic reaction of anger, or a basic reaction of pride even, because he thought himself all those years to be better than anyone else. So we are aiming to become conscious. We are aiming to liberate our essence. We're doing that very same work. But we can do this work in our regular everyday lives, because there's plenty going on for us to see every day of our lives. Each of us has our own particular situation, which will bring up our own particular reactions. And these are the ones that we're going to look at. These are the egos that we have that we're going to work with. This is why we are doing this work. There are so many reasons. We're activating our essence. We're freeing ourselves from reactions where we can experience happiness and true freedom when we don't have the ego in our minds. We can experience the superior dimensions. We can ultimately escape from the wheel of samsara. We get to know ourselves. We change our level of being. We get rid of centuries-old selves, egos, or psychic adjuncts that have attached themselves to our essence. If we help ourselves and change ourselves, we also help those around us, because we present with them a different way of life, an alternative way of life. So how do we do this? Well, there are two parts to this work. The first part of the work is establishing the self-remembrance. And if you remember from the image on the previous page, the free essence only accounts for 3%. The rest of the 97% of essence is trapped by the ego. So if I bring up my pen here, effectively, if each one of these little dots represents my essence, each essence is trapped by an ego. I could draw a circle around each of these dots. So here we are. We have the 97% of essence trapped within ego. 3% only remains free. When we are born, that's the free 3% that we can see in a newborn baby. And here, if I draw it here, that 3% is gathered up. It's easier to see. It's plain in the beautiful aspect of a child. As the child gets to be about 4 or 5, there still is a core of essence there. But more of the essence now has started to be separated. It's started to be conditioned by the personality and the ego. We get conditioned by 3 main egos: self-love, self-consideration, and mythomania. Mythomania we could also describe as megalomania, if you like. We become the centre of our own world. Everything is about us. Self-consideration relates to that aspect of poor me. No one's nice to me. Everyone's mean to me. Self-love, it's that idea of myself as me, and no one should insult me or tell me anything. By the time we've got to being adults, there's the fragmentation has occurred almost completely. There's only a very small portion of essence at any one time that we can access. We can access it every now and again if we apply the self-remembrance, but generally the egos of those 3% have conditioned even that little bit of free essence that we have. Now, to get rid of these egos is not the same as to get rid of the core, or the 97% that we're talking about over here. To get rid of these egos is a matter of remembering ourselves, because when we remember ourselves, we gather up that 3% again. We move these pieces of free essence into one place again, as it was when we were a child, as it was when we were young. So bit by bit, as we start to become more conscious, those aspects of self-consideration and so on, we can actually override them just by remembering ourselves. So if somebody insults us, we don't react in the same way. We simply carry on remembering ourselves. This represents a journey up the vertical path, up the level of being. But it also represents the reclaiming of that loose 3% that we have. This is the first part of the work. When that 3% has been gathered, we can say that we're now at a very different level of being than we were when it was all scattered. So we start at a certain level of being. And we might start at a level of being that's down here, say, and we have many reactions, and our essence is widely dispersed throughout the day. We're thinking all the time, all over many different things. But as we become more focused and more concentrated, then we can go up the different levels. And this goes along with the work and the exercises that we've been teaching you. The first 2 steps, remember, are the willpower, using the willpower, which is related to action. The second aspect is related to perception, which is where we know what we are doing. It's represented here by our sense also. Our perception is connected to the senses. In the case of this man here, if he's walking along and he knows he's walking, he's using steps 1 and steps 2. That enables him to start gathering up those loose bits of essence which are being distracted. The third step then is where we remember to do this sufficiently and for a long enough time. When the duration of time in which we remembered ourselves carries on, the duration of the time where we've practiced the will and the perception is strong enough, we reach to a state of self-remembrance. And here the essence is fully gathered up. The 3% is gathered up. When the 3% is gathered up, then we teach that 3% not to identify with things of everyday life. This is where somebody may insult us. We call it non-identification. This is where somebody may insult us, and yet because we're in self-remembrance, it simply doesn't affect us at all. We carry on remembering ourselves. All of those mechanical reactions that we normally have, we're not identified with the external world, so we don't have those same reactions. In the state of non-identification, even when we have thoughts that tell us, how dare he do that, or so on, we simply don't go along with those thoughts. Then we reach to stage 5. And in this stage, the essence is able to observe a state we call self-observation. It is in this condition where we can now tackle the other 97% of ego. Self-observation is where the essence, the full 3%, has gathered. It has enough strength not to be identified with things of the external world, and at the same time, it can observe consciously what it needs to. In this condition, the essence can observe the origin of its own egos. It can observe the causes of his reactions. Self-observation is a fantastic tool for us in the inner work. We all have this faculty of self-observation, but it is atrophied. So how do we go about this first part of the work? Well, we use the psychological gymnasium that we're faced with. This is the situation that we find ourselves in everyday life. We shouldn't complain about difficult situations in life, but use them to see how we can overcome those reactions, what they are, how we can remember ourselves in front of any representation. Our egos spontaneously appear. They spontaneously jump out in any given situation, and we can learn to observe them. We can learn to see them in these situations. Some masters who have completed this work along the way say that they receive letters asking for help, and the letters complain often of spouses or their situation in life and say, "Can't you help me, master? My wife is not suitable for me," or "Can't you help me, master? I have a job where I have to work too hard." But nobody writes about being content with these adverse situations. These adverse situations are precisely the conditions in which we can work. Remember the holy man in India who went to the cave. He didn't give his essence the opportunity to learn. He rather created an artificial scenario of peace and tranquility. Certainly it is true, as we say in the next point here, we want a paradise, but a paradise is useless to us because it doesn't allow us to flex the muscles of the essence. It doesn't allow us to develop and grow. All of the information that we need for our awakening is contained within our own essence. As we start to activate that essence, it starts to know what it has to do. It starts to learn. It also starts to see what is useful for it and what is not useful for it. So we can say that we need to take advantage of adversities. If someone offends our self-esteem, then that is an opportunity for us to go up the vertical path, not to give our essence to that reaction. I put a little note on the bottom here that this is an objective observation done by the essence. Self-observation is done by the essence. So the second part of the work is where we can dissolve the egos that hold the other 97%. There are 3 steps to dissolve the ego. This takes time, as does, of course, the first part of the work. But the 3 steps are very straightforward. Number 1, self-observation. Number 2, we comprehend and judge the ego. Number 3, we eliminate it. And I want to emphasize that this is a practice for later on when self-remembrance has been installed, when self-observation has been installed. Because when self-observation is there, we know what it is we are looking at. Otherwise, it's simply the mind looking at the mind, or the ego looking at itself, and that will never dissolve the ego. That essence that's trapped within the ego has to be dissolved, but it can only be dissolved if it's been observed, understood, and then eliminated. So self-observation is essential. As it says in the same book, there is no way an unrecognized mistake can be eliminated. It is urgent that we observe the things we want to eliminate from our psyche. If a person hasn't practiced self-observation, what are they going to see? Now remember, self-observation is an advanced stage. It's 0.5 on our list from before. At that point, it is the essence that does the observation. In this case, we can observe the ego as we would a spy in the time of war. Self-observation is a faculty that we can develop. As we said, it is atrophied in humanity, but it does develop as we use it. It's like a sixth sense, if you like. Number 2 is where we judge and comprehend and show our comprehension of the ego. We place the ego in the dock. We comprehend it. We see its origins. We present all the data. We see it for all the harm it has caused us and all the mistakes we've made because of it in this life and in the past lives. We face the facts of the ego with no excuses or justifications or considerations. Indeed, we are truly yearning to be rid of it, because who wants to have an ego, say an ego of anger, on our backs for century after century? This is an opportunity for us to get rid of those ancient reactions. The third step is elimination. Elimination of the ego. This cannot be done by the mind, because the mind can only move it about, but not fundamentally alter it. We need a power superior to the mind, and for this we ask our Divine Mother for help. This is a role that is carried out by her. This is the part of our being that is responsible for doing this. What we do, having placed the ego in the dock, we judge it and ask her then to eliminate it with her flaming spear. We present that work that we have done to the innermost being, to the innermost mother. Then, having shown her that we've understood, we've seen the ego, we know it for what it's done, we ask her from the heart to eliminate it. We ask simply and naturally like a child, and we imagine her throwing a flaming spear at the ego. This is essential from the point of view of rescuing the essence that's inside. What she's doing here is burning off the psychic adjunct, that subconscious, infraconscious aspect called the ego that's attached itself to that part of our essence. This is the way to dissolve the ego. It doesn't happen all at once. It can happen over several attempts. When we've understood the ego completely, we have to work on it quite a bit. Sometimes those big heavy egos require a lot of work. Other times the smaller egos, they can be eliminated. But it's the innermost mother who does this work for us. There's plenty of images that symbolize this whole battle, this whole fight. St. George and the Dragon is a classic one. And here, for example, we see George on the horse. This represents us as fighting aspirants trying to remove our ego. And the ego, of course, has the essence trapped, held within it. So we are working to kill that ego in order to free the essence. There's another example here. Here's George killing the dragon, and there, of course, is the essence in the background, waiting to be liberated. She's like the sleeping beauty in the castle, which the night, the shining night, which is us in our attempt at working. We are the students, we are the knights in shining armour, trying to rescue the essence from the beast. Here's another image from a different tradition, and this one actually has the Divine Mother with her many arms, which represent the many attributes that she has in this world. Because, of course, the innermost mother she has many roles within our work. Removing the ego is one of them. Here we see she has the sword, and she's cutting the head off the ego. Then, in another tradition altogether, completely different, the Greek tradition, here we have Perseus, who's chopped off the head of the Medusa. And these are the serpents and the hair of the Medusa that represent the ego, which turn everybody into stone. When the essence is trapped by the ego, it is inert. It cannot act. It's trapped. So that is the theoretical part of dissolving the ego. It's a practice for much later on, but it's important that we know it, because then we know where we're aiming for. Our aim is to liberate the essence in its entirety. But for now, we can do a practice called the death in motion. This is something we can do if we find ourselves in a difficult situation, if we find ourselves in trouble. It's a temporary stoppage of the ego. It buys us some time. It prevents psychological elements from manifesting uncontrollably. To give you an example, you might, say, for example, be going to the dentist, sitting in the dentist chair, and all of a sudden an ego of fear comes over you. In those moments we can petition, Innermost Mother, remove these egos of fear from me. And imagine the Innermost Mother coming in and removing them with her flaming sword. And then we can find we're left in peace from that ego. This doesn't destroy the ego, but it weakens it. It gives us space. Later on then we can look at the ego in more detail when we come to do our practice of retrospection. When we're doing this practice, use concentration and imagination. Be firm and ask from the heart. We really do want to get rid of that reaction. And when we have that reaction and we feel that it's all on top of us, repeatedly ask to the innermost mother, to the innermost being, to remove that ego from us. And if it's still holding on, continue asking. Ask until we find that it's gone. Now, I mentioned the retrospection practice. The retrospection practice is where, at the end of the day, we come back to look over the events of the day. We've already been doing this every morning when we wake up, and we're reviewing the dreams, looking to see where we went during the night. Now we're reviewing the day. We're rewinding the day, seeing the day like a film. So we're rewinding the day and seeing it as a film on the screen of our mind. You can start from the moment when we go to bed and work backwards. We are looking to see what we are like, thoughts, feelings and actions that we didn't notice before. And we're just observing it at this stage. Rewind the film of the day, recreate the scene, reconstruct the characters, the events, what was said, what wasn't said, what was done, what wasn't done. Go over the things that you can see that happened. See it like a film. Ask the innermost being to help you with this, because when this happens, we're often shown something that is unexpected, that we missed, or an ego that was there at the back of us with a secret motivation for a particular purpose. This is not an intellectual practice. It's one where we try and create a separation from ourselves, who are watching the film of the day, and the events as they took place. Certainly, it's not for us to get involved in it all over again. We're simply looking. We're trying to get information, remember. We're checking out what happens within our psyche. And that is the purpose of the retrospection. We're looking for information. We can see desires, selves, fantasies that we didn't see, or we can look at any reactions we had during the day. All of this is useful for the knowledge of ourselves. We can learn that we have our own psychology. Also, it helps us to put order to our work, particularly if we see a repetitious reaction, something that happens a lot, then we can work out, use our qualities to overcome that situation. This order comes about gradually, and it is established by our inner being. The ego does not establish order, as it is disorder. This practice allows us to see our work, how well or badly we are doing. And we're always looking from the point of view of how we can improve things, how we can change things, how we can develop ourselves. So we're not looking to judge, oh, I'm this type of person or that type of person. What matters is that we become more conscious. We're looking to become conscious in our lives. So that's it for this talk. As part of the homework, at the end of the day, carry out the retrospection. It does help to be quite concentrated before you carry out the retrospection. So before you do that, just relax the body, focus the mind, and then carry out the retrospection. Also, keep up the sit-down practices. For example, relaxing and listening to 10 or 15 minutes of music in attention. Listen and know that you're listening. Or continue with the practice of concentration on an object, and it can be a candle, a plant, a glass of water. Or you can continue with the hamsa. Very importantly though, keep up the daily exercises of the self-remembrance. Keep in mind our objective is to gather up the 3% of free essence. This is the crucial first part of the work, and it cannot be done in any other way than learning to live more consciously from moment to moment in all our activities. In the next lecture, we'll see how we can do that better. But for now, absorb the information from this lecture, put into action, put into practice the inner death in motion if the situation arises, and try out the retrospection. We'll talk again next week on how to review our work and how to improve it. As ever, if there's any questions, email us at info@htsk.ie.